would suggest to you, particularly for a school board campaign or a local or legislative race, because you're not going to get news media coverage on a daily basis. What I'd suggest that you do, even before you officially announce your candidacy, at the point where you're still beginning to reach out to the community and talk to prospective donors and potential volunteers, is make an appointment to see representatives from the news media who cover your community. The LA Times isn't going to cover your story every day, but maybe there's a community or a neighborhood weekly paper that will cover your race on a regular basis. Maybe it's a website or a blog. But even if they're not going to be covering it every day, the LA Times, the Daily News, the Daily Breeze, wherever you happen to be living, it's worth going over, it's worth reaching out and introducing yourself to the person or people most likely to cover the campaign. And if you don't know who those people are, then ask. Go online and look up the politics editor or the education editor, call them or email them and introduce yourself. Say, I'd like to come over and meet with you or the reporter who may be covering this campaign over the course of the next year. And I know you're not going to be covering it on a daily basis, but I was hoping we could have a time to sit down and get to know each other a little bit before the campaign gets underway. That doesn't mean the reporter is going to cover you more favorably, but the better they know you, the more likely it is that they're going to cover you more accurately. And like I said, if I do my job as a communicator, whether it's a candidate or an advisor, they cover it accurately. Since my message is better, then I'm going to win. So, reporters aren't the enemy. They're not your friends. But they're co-workers, and they ought to be treated that way. Because even if they work in a different building and report to a different boss and have a somewhat different idea on how your joint project of news coverage of the campaign ought to turn out, you're still working on the same joint project. It's in yours and their best interest for there to be media coverage of your campaign. And the more you work with them, even if they don't do everything exactly the way you want them to, well, it's not going to be the first coworker or the last coworker who didn't agree with you on everything either. The second thing I want to talk about is selecting media opportunities. Because once again, in a race for a school board or a city council position, you're not going to get coverage on a daily basis. And even if you're running for Congress or for governor or for U.S. Senator, you're not going to get as much coverage as you think you deserve. And one of the toughest things in the world is having the self-awareness. One of the toughest things in the campaign world is the self-awareness to help to try to decide whether something is newsworthy or if it's not. The problem I face as a candidate is that I think everything I say and do is fascinating. I'm riveting. When I speak, the earth moves, the angels weep. And I cannot believe that news media is not here to get every one of those utterances down and to broadcast it across the state, syllable by syllable. It doesn't work that way. And what I learned very quickly is if I attempt to gain news coverage every time I'm going to say something that's almost that fascinating, well, then I became the candidate who cried wolf. And of course, you guys all remember the story about the boy who cried wolf. He cried wolf, there was no wolf. He cried wolf, there was no wolf. He cried wolf, there was no wolf. When there was a wolf, no one came. And the exact same dynamic holds here as well. If I call a news conference for a reason that the media judges to not be of sufficient import, once, twice, 3 times. But when I finally do call them for something that really is important, they're going to tune me out. They're going to say, oh, there's that Schnur just whining again. So I need to be selective. And the question I ask myself, either as a candidate or an advisor, is I ask myself, if I weren't running for this office, or if I weren't working for the candidate running for this office, would I care? And if you remember, we're going to go back to the conversation we had in the very first week of class about how people don't care. And remember, it's not people don't care, period. It's not people don't care, exclamation point. It's people don't care, comma. At least not as much as we do. Well, you ask yourself this, in that context, you ask the question. If I didn't care about my campaign as much as I do, If I didn't care about me as much as I do, would I care about this? And it's one of the many, many reasons, by the way, that even the most politically savvy of candidates, the most politically savvy of candidates, need someone or someones to trust and to rely on. Whether it's a campaign manager that you can afford to pay for, or just a loyal friend who's volunteering his or her time to help you, you need someone else helping you make decisions other than yourself. Why? Because you can't have perspective about yourself. You need somebody who isn't you to be able to take half a step back and say, hey, Bertrand, that's not nearly as interesting as you think it is. Some of the smartest candidates I've ever worked with failed to get elected to office because they knew they were smarter than their advisors and they weren't willing to listen to them. And again, even if it's not a paid staffer, even if it's a friend, even if it's a volunteer, have someone you can trust, you can respect, who you can rely on, who isn't you. Because that person just metaphysically is going to be able to give you perspective that you can't give yourself. I had a boss years and years ago, I may have told you this earlier in our discussions. He used to say the candidate has to be Ulysses. He has to say, or she has to say to the staff, tie me to my mast. Help me avoid those sirens. Because Ulysses, of course, knew that he couldn't avoid those sirens by himself. He needed someone to help him. A candidate, once your name's the one on the bumper sticker, once it's your name in the headline, it's impossible to have perspective. And if there's time later, I'll tell you a story or two about candidates who thought they had perspective and didn't, at much higher levels of stakes involved. But for this, when it comes to scheduling a news event, ask yourself, and more importantly, ask somebody who you trust. Would somebody other than you and me care about this? And more often than not, the overwhelming majority of times you ask that question, the answer is going to be no. It is entirely possible in a campaign for school board or for city council or for legislature, in fact, it is entirely possible that you might attract news coverage only twice in your entire campaign. The day you announce your candidacy, and on election night, when you declare victory or concede defeat. That's the worst possible circumstance. Even a local race, even a school board race in a metropolis like Los Angeles can usually attract some additional coverage along the way, even if it's just online. But in the worst possible circumstance, you might only get 2 shots at the apple in this particular regard. So ask yourself, is this something that I would care about if I weren't me, if I weren't working for the race? And if the answer is no, it doesn't mean you shouldn't get the information out. It doesn't mean you shouldn't make the information public, but rather find a lower stakes way of doing it. Now, we'll talk about a news conference in just a minute, which is a very high stakes way of getting information out. But how else can you get a news conference? How else can you get news out in a less high stakes way? Number one, you can put that news out on paper or online in a press release. And what unfortunately we're not going to have time for in this particular class is to go through the mechanics of writing a press release. But there's no shortage of information online on how to do it. I'm more than happy to work with Brent and with the other people from the program to help you guys find that information if you need it. But at least conceptually speaking today, for a race further down the political ladder, when in doubt, put the information out on paper or online. Because that way, if there is someone out there who does care, well, they'll have that information available and they can always contact you back to ask you additional information. But if the majority of your news audience does not care, then you have to put yourself and your candidate in a potentially precarious position of standing up in front of, well, nothing. Standing up in front of no one. I used to actually, when I worked for the governor, I had a picture in my office that a reporter covering the state capitol had given me early in my time with the governor. And it was a photograph of room 1190, which is the governor's press conference room, kitty corner from the governor's office on the first floor of the state capitol. And a photographer from the Associated Press had gone to the very back of room 1190, and with a wide-angle lens had taken a picture. And on the podium, there were about a dozen, maybe 14 men in suits. One standing at the microphone, the other standing around him, all obviously getting ready to speak. Bless you. And what this wide-angle lens showed is that there were row after row after row after row of empty seats where reporters would have been had the announcement been of sufficient news value. So she gave me this picture, and I kept it behind my desk. So whenever I thought about calling a news conference, I would think about the prospect of my candidate or my office holder standing in a microphone with all sorts of people behind him and nobody in front of him. Paper spares you that. What's another lower stakes way of disseminating information? An interview. And in particular, if there's a relatively small number of reporters interested in your campaign, sitting down with them in person or on the telephone one-on-one is a much more likely way to attract coverage than holding a news conference. Because it's personal. Because you're giving that reporter all of your time and attention, rather than asking him or her to share it with a group of others. And so when possible, when the candidate schedule allows, even if it means scheduling a series of interviews, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in a row, it might not be an efficient use of time, but it's a much more likely way to attract news coverage. Because again, you're talking to that reporter, those reporters on an individual basis rather than talking to them in a group. The other advantage of an interview is, while you can't necessarily control the discussion, because the reporter is going to ask the questions that he or she wants and follow up the way he or she wants, it's a particularly effective way of dealing with a more challenging matter. Either an issue on which it takes more time for you to explain your position, something from your biography, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that might be unflattering. Because when you can have that, think about when you can have a conversation one-on-one with somebody, particularly a difficult or potentially unpleasant conversation, isn't it easier to do it just in a face-to-face conversation than trying to have it with a whole bunch of people? Say you have a student who's been acting out in class, and he or she hasn't been conducting themselves the way you want them to. Well, one thing to do is to talk to that student in front of the rest of the classroom. The other alternative is to talk to that young man or that young woman individually and privately. There's no guarantee that the conversation is going to result the way you want it to, but the odds are better. And I think you know as a teacher, sometimes it's better to take the necessary time to have conversations with 4 or 5 students in a row, even if they're the identical conversations, than to have them do a group. And I'm not comparing news reporters to children. Right? We're going to have to turn that off if that's what it's coming across. But what I am saying is the interpersonal dynamic is exactly the same one. Particularly for a difficult or challenging conversation, it's always better to have it in a one-on-one conversation than to have it to the masses. So why do we have news conferences? May I'll come to you in just a second. Why do we have news conferences? Well, when you're running for an office that attracts a large amount of news media attention, the only real reason to do it is because of time efficiency. It takes less time to talk to 10 or 20 or 50 reporters than it takes in these separate conversations with all of them. You know the other reason we do it? Same reason I've attributed other tendencies to earlier in this class. The other reason we'll schedule a news conference is ego. I am the candidate. Hear me roar. I am the candidate. Therefore, I should stand in front of all of you, sharing my knowledge, leavening me. And it's an ego stroke to stand up there and have all these. Come on, think about it. The first time you stood in front of a classroom, even if you were a little bit scared, it's a little bit of an ego stroke to have all those kids sitting there listening to you. Well, imagine if those aren't 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. Imagine if it's 25 and 30 and 35-year-old professionals who sit there riveted and frantically scribbling down every word. And you think because you've seen it on West Wing and because you've seen it on CNN, you think, okay, I'm a candidate, so I'm in a news conference now. The only reason of a news conference is when time doesn't allow you to talk to the reporters individually. It sounds glamorous, it sounds exciting, but if you got the time available, better to have those conversations one-on-one, even if it's a series of them.